So number 3 on the list is sensitive data exposure. And similar to number 2, I kind of want to just talk about it theoretically from a attack and defense perspective, and then we'll dive into Burp Suite and we'll talk about, how we might hunt for these things and what are some common scenarios. So sensitive data exposure is exactly what it sounds like. Imagine that you're testing against a hospital and the hospital is exposing PII or personally identifiable information, or you like a social security number or a date of birth, patient information, whatever. Or you're testing against a client and they're exposing credit card or financial information that violates, PCI data. Those are very bad situations. There can be situations where, you have passwords stored in a clear text file. I've had situations in the past, and I can tell you 2 of them. So one situation is that recently I was testing against a bug bounty program, and that bug bounty program was a government program. It's public, so it's okay to talk about this, but the program had a JavaScript file that was wide open, right? And this JavaScript file, if you read into it, guess what? There were stored credentials in there to access their website. I love testing against government because the government just kind of has weak protocols and weak websites, and it helps to test against them, make them better. And it also is a good way to find a lot of interesting flaws out there in the wild. So, those stored credentials, that's a big no-no. That's a sensitive data exposure. Here's another example. About a month ago, I was testing against a client of mine, and they were a healthcare provider. Now, I went to their website, navigated to a directory, and that directory was a backup directory. That never should have been exposed. Guess what that backup directory had? An entire zip of their whole website. Now, the source code, every single thing behind the website. I downloaded that file. It was available to the entire public. Downloaded that file, and inside were, again, the source code, credentials, SQL database credentials, all kinds of stuff. That's things you do not want out there. So that's another example of sensitive data exposure. So if we scroll down just a bit here and we look at the different preventions, honestly, you want to make sure that your data is necessary to be on the application, right? You don't store data if you don't have to store it, right? Don't store sensitive data unnecessarily, as this says. Make sure that your data is encrypted at rest. Wherever it lands, make sure that it is encrypted. We don't want to just be able to access a file and everything's in clear text. Make sure that your files are not just in a directory that's accessible by anybody, right? Make sure that you are using strong passwords. Make sure you're using good protocols. And it says here, it talks about HSTS. We'll talk about that briefly in the next video, just about headers and why they're important. And we'll talk about it as well in the testing aspect. But there's also example attack scenarios. I think you probably get it by now, right? Like it's sensitive data exposure. There's so many different ways that this can happen, and there's so many different things that this can fall under. But what it really boils down to is your enumeration ability. What are you looking at, and how well can you sift through everything that's on that application? So the better investigator, information gatherer, enumerator that you are, the better off you're going to be. I've been saying that this entire course, but this holds true for a lot of web app testing, because it's not just cut and dry, here's the data. You might have to dig deep for that directory. You might have to read through 100 JavaScript files to find those stored credentials. It's not always just plain as day right in front of you. Sometimes it is, but not always. So that's a good overview. We're going to go into the next video where we actually do a little bit of testing for it. I'm just going to walk you through one of the examples, and we'll talk about some other things in terms of security headers and why they're important and what we're looking for. So that's it. I'll meet you over in the next video.